Share my bed or freeze, the Apache woman's demand to the lonely cowboy on a snowbound night. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The year was 1881, late December, when the Wyoming Territory lay under weeks of snow and wind. The high plains were stripped bare of color, nothing but gray-scrubbed white ground and brown rock where the drifts had not swallowed it. The winters had grown harder the last few years, or maybe that was just how Matthew Cole felt them. He was 30 and a man who had lived too long with his grief. He had been a husband and a father once. His wife had died out of fever, his little boy just days after. That had been 3 winters ago, and since then, his life had been reduced to keeping his cabin standing, feeding his horses, and making sure he woke to another day. He did not drink, did not gamble, did not seek out the towns because towns carried people, and people meant questions. He stayed because he had nowhere else to roam, and silence was easier than answering to anyone. His cabin sat half a mile off the trail, built from pine he had cut himself. 1 room, low ceiling, plank bed against the wall, a table, 2 chairs, and a stove that held the only warmth. It was a place for surviving, not for living, and he had accepted that. His mission now was simple: get through winter, chop enough wood so the stove never went cold, keep the horses fed so they'd last until spring, lay low and hope the loneliness did not hollow him out more than it already had. The night the knock came, the storm had been building since dusk. The wind rose like a steady hand, pressing against the walls, rattling the shutters, shaking the latch of the door. Snow drove sideways across the windows and filled the cracks in the wood with powder that sifted through, no matter how many times he sealed them. He sat at the table with a lantern burning low, mending a strap of leather with needle and thread, the rifle propped beside him out of habit. The fire popped in the stove, the only other sound inside. At first he thought he imagined it, a thump against the door, faint under the storm. He froze, needle halfway through the leather. Then came another, louder, a knock, urgent and real. His chest tightened. No one came this far without reason, and he had learned long ago that reason was rarely good. He took the rifle in hand, the wood of the stock worn smooth against his palm, and crossed the room in silence. He listened at the door. For a moment there was nothing but the wind. Then 3 knocks again, uneven, weaker this time. He pulled the latch and yanked the door open, rifle angled but not raised. A woman stood there, half buried in the snow. She leaned forward, as if the storm itself pushed her toward him. Her hair, long and black, clung in frozen strands across her face. Her skin was bronze, her lips cracked from cold, and her eyes, dark, sharp, unbroken, even while her body shook, locked straight onto his. She wore a deerskin dress, fringed and decorated faintly with beadwork, but it was torn at the neckline and hem. The fabric was stiff with frost and clung to her curves where the seams had frayed at her chest. Her cleavage showed in a way that was not meant to tempt, but could not be ignored, a mark of how poorly the garment had withstood the cold. Her voice came hoarse, rough from the wind that had cut her throat raw. Share my bed or freeze. For a moment his instinct was to shut the door. He had made rules for himself. No one else, no entanglements, no reasons to hope. He had told himself he would never again be responsible for another life. His pulse hitched, and he felt a flicker of panic at the thought of someone stepping into the cabin and into his silence. But his eyes took in the tremor of her shoulders, the way her breath came shallow, the raw red of her fingers curled at her sides. If he left her there, she would be dead before morning. He knew it. He lowered the rifle, stepped back, and said nothing. She crossed the threshold fast, as if she knew he could change his mind at any second. The heat from the stove hit her, and she gasped, shutting her eyes for a moment, then turned to face him. Snow fell from her hair onto the floorboards. She pulled her arms tight around herself, her torn dress clinging damp against her figure. Her eyes stayed on him, wary but unflinching. She looked like someone who had been told to beg and chose instead to command. Matthew closed the door against the storm, set the rifle aside, and studied her in the light of the lantern. He could see how young she was, maybe 24. Apache, he thought, by her dress and bearing. That meant trouble if others were out there looking for her. But she stood alone. He fetched a blanket from the bed and placed it near the stove. She sat slowly, pulling it over her shoulders but never dropping her gaze from him. He crossed back to the stove, ladled thin stew into a tin bowl, and set it down in front of her without a word. She hesitated for half a second, then picked it up with both hands and drank. Her eyes softened only slightly, but he saw the relief in her shoulders as warmth spread through her. He leaned against the table, arms crossed, watching her eat. His mind ran fast despite his calm face. Who was she? Why was she here? Was someone chasing her? He had no answers yet, only the sense that the storm had delivered her to his door with no warning and no chance for refusal. He felt the tightness in his chest again, not panic this time, but something he had not felt in years, the stir of responsibility. The wind battered harder, making the cabin groan under the weight. He stoked the stove, feeding it more wood. When he turned back, she was standing now, blankets still around her shoulders. She moved to his bed without asking, pulled the covers aside, and slipped under them, still watching him, her eyes dark and steady. She left space beside her, clear in what she expected. Matthew stood still, breath tight, thoughts heavy. He remembered his wife in that bed, the nights of warmth before the sickness came. He remembered holding his child until he went still. His hand trembled against the back of the chair. Everything in him wanted to keep the wall up, to stay untouched, but the storm pressed against the cabin with no sign of letting up. The woman lay there, her face half lit by the lantern, her body drawn tight in the blanket, her eyes holding both command and fear. He moved at last, slow and deliberate, boots still on, and sat at the edge of the bed. She shifted closer, her shoulder brushing his arm. Her warmth seeped into him, her breath quiet but steady. Neither spoke. The storm filled the silence, and the fire burned low. Matthew stared at the ceiling, every muscle tight, his mind caught between fear of what this meant and the simple truth that she was alive because he had let her in. That was enough for tonight. For the first time in 3 winters, the cabin was not empty. The storm did not let up through the night. It clawed at the cabin walls, shook the roof beams, and drove snow across the shuttered windows until even the lantern light seemed swallowed. Inside, the air grew close from the stove, the faint smell of wood smoke mixing with the dampness of her wet dress as it slowly dried. Matthew lay stiff on one side of the bed, boots still on, his back half turned toward the woman beside him. He could feel her warmth pressing through the thin layers of blanket and cloth. Every time she shifted, his muscles tensed, his mind catching on the memory of what the bed had once been, a place he had shared with his wife before sickness stole her. He tried to keep still, eyes fixed on the ceiling beams, but his heart worked against him. She was close enough that her breath touched his shoulder, steady and real, and it had been years since another human being had rested beside him. Part of him wanted to pull away, to keep that wall of silence intact, but another part, quieter but stubborn, told him to let her stay. She had come to his door half frozen. If he had shut her out, he knew she'd already be buried under the snow. That fact alone kept him where he was. He noticed small details he wished he didn't, her hair drying in strands across the blanket, her shoulders shivering every so often, the curve of her chest where the torn fabric gave no protection. He forced his eyes away, ashamed at himself, though he was only a man trying to keep control. Sleep came in broken stretches, shallow and restless. By morning, the storm had calmed, though it left the world outside buried deep. The silence after the wind was heavy, like the air itself held its breath. Matthew rose first, pulling on his coat and lighting another lamp before feeding wood into the stove. He glanced at her, still in the bed. She was awake, eyes open, watching him carefully. Her face had more color now, her lips no longer cracked from cold. She sat up slowly, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. "I need to know your name," Matthew said finally, his voice low but firm. She hesitated, as though deciding whether to give it. "Nia," she answered. The word carried strength, even though her voice was rough. Matthew nodded once. "You come from a band nearby?" She shook her head. "No, my people scattered, some dead, some taken." She looked at the floor, her hands tightening around the edge of the blanket. "I walked many days. Men followed. I lost them in the storm." That answered the questions he had turned over in his mind during the night. Why she had come to his door, why she had carried herself like someone used to fighting for her own survival. She was not here by chance. She had been running, and the storm had forced her into his path. Matthew poured coffee into 2 tin cups and set one down for her. She reached out slowly, eyes never leaving his, as if still unsure whether he would pull it away. He didn't. She drank, wincing at the heat, but her shoulders eased slightly afterward. "You can stay until the storm breaks," Matthew said after a long silence. His words felt heavier than they should have, because in them lay a decision he didn't plan to make. Bringing someone into his cabin meant changing the routine that had kept him steady for 3 winters. It meant facing questions he had buried, questions about whether he was still capable of caring for another soul. Naya studied him with those dark eyes, unblinking. "I stay until I can walk without freezing," she said. Not a plea, not thanks, just fact. Matthew felt a flicker of something at her tone. He recognized it. Stubbornness. The will to survive. He respected it, even if it unsettled him. He pulled the pot of stew from the stove, set another portion in front of her. She ate carefully this time, not as desperate as the night before. As she ate, Matthew studied her clothing. The dress was not only torn, but also thin, not fit for the depth of Wyoming winter. If she stepped out in it again, she would not last an hour. He moved to the small chest near the bed, pulled out a wool shirt too large for her, and set it on the table. "You'll need this," he said. Her eyes flicked to the shirt, then back to him. She seemed caught between pride and need. After a pause, she reached for it. She held the fabric in her hands, tracing it with her fingers, as if the gesture alone cost her something. She did not put it on, not yet, but he saw the way her grip tightened. The day passed in silence, broken only by the sound of chores. Matthew shoveled snow from the door, checked the horses in the lean-to stable, and split wood until his arms ached. Each time he stepped back inside, she was there by the fire, sometimes watching him, sometimes staring into the flames with a far-off look that spoke of more than she said aloud. He wondered what horrors she had seen, what losses she carried, but he didn't ask. He knew the weight of silence, and sometimes it was easier to carry it without words. By evening, the wind had quieted enough to hear the creak of trees outside. Matthew sat at the table cleaning his rifle. Naya rose from her place by the stove, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and moved to him. Without speaking, she reached for the shirt he had given her earlier. She pulled it on over her torn dress, the fabric hanging loose on her frame but covering her shoulders at last. Then she sat opposite him, her hands resting on the table. "You lost someone too," she said quietly. Matthew's hands stilled on the rifle. He looked up, startled, and for a moment anger flickered in him. Not at her, but at the wound her words pressed on. He thought of his wife's fevered skin, of his boy's small hand growing still in his own. He had not spoken of them to anyone since they died. He forced his jaw to unclench. "Yes," he said at last, nothing more. Naya did not press. She only nodded as if she understood enough. The fire burned low again, and the night closed in. This time, when they lay in the bed, Matthew took off his boots. He lay back slowly, feeling her warmth when she shifted closer. He did not touch her, not yet, but her presence eased the emptiness that had lived in him too long. He stared at the ceiling beams, listening to the quiet, and realized something had shifted already. The cabin was no longer just a shelter, for one. The next morning brought a pale sun, weak behind clouds, but enough to cast a faint silver light across the plains. Snow lay deep against the cabin walls, higher than a man's waist, and Matthew knew travel would be impossible for days. He stood at the window, his breath fogging the glass as he measured the drifts outside, already running through the work that would be needed to keep the horses alive and the stove fed. Behind him, he heard the sound of the blanket shifting on the bed. Naya sat up slowly, her dark hair falling loose over the wool shirt he had given her. She looked stronger than she had the night before, though her eyes still carried the sharp alertness of someone used to danger. Matthew felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper. It was no longer just about keeping himself alive. She had said men had followed her, and if that was true, the storm would not stop them forever. Questions pressed against his thoughts. Who were they? How many, and why had they driven her so far into the wilderness? He had not asked the night before, but now he knew he would have to. He turned from the window, pulled on his coat, and started laying more wood into the stove. "You'll tell me more," he said, his voice calm but carrying weight. Nia looked at him steadily, then lowered her eyes. "They were traders," she said at last. "Men who buy and sell. They wanted me for trade. I ran when I could." She clenched her hands in her lap. "If they find me, they won't stop." Her words left the room heavy. Matthew had heard stories like it before, and worse. He felt anger stir, slow but deep, though his face stayed controlled. He knew what it meant. If she had escaped them, those men would not forget. And if they tracked her here, it would not be only her life at risk. He pushed the thought down. He could not send her back into the snow. Whatever came, he had already chosen when he let her cross his threshold. He made breakfast, thick slices of cornbread from the pan and what was left of the stew. They ate in silence, but the silence was different now. It carried something between them, understanding, if not yet trust. Naya ate slowly, her eyes moving around the cabin, noting every detail as though memorizing it. She seemed less defensive than the night before, though she still sat with her shoulders square, as if ready for whatever might come. After they ate, Matthew set about the chores. The door had to be shoveled clear just to open it, and the horses needed water melted from snow. He moved with the same steady rhythm he always had, but now he found himself glancing back toward the cabin more than once, half expecting to see her gone, half worried she might still be too weak to manage on her own. When he came back inside, he saw her near the fire, holding a needle and thread he had left on the table. She was mending the sleeve of his worn shirt, working carefully, her brow furrowed in concentration. It stopped him for a moment. No one had touched his clothes since his wife. The sight pulled at him in ways he didn't want to admit, and yet he couldn't look away. Naya noticed his stare, paused, then handed the shirt back with a small nod. "Better now," she said simply. He took it without answering, though his throat felt tight. He wanted to ask her more, to know if she had family left, to know what she planned once the snow melted. But he forced himself to hold back. She was here now, and that was all that mattered with Dubai shattered for the day. As evening fell, the cabin grew warm with the fire. Nia moved closer to the stove, her hair catching the glow, her figure outlined against the light. Matthew sat at the table, hands resting heavy on the wood, his thoughts circling. He knew men would ask questions if they saw her. In the towns, prejudice against Apache was sharp and cruel. If he took her there, she would face danger all over again. Here at least, the cabin gave her cover, though it tied him closer to her fate. Naya broke the quiet, "And you didn't ask me why I knocked." Matthew looked up, caught off guard by her voice. "I chose this door," she said. "Not just because of the storm. I saw smoke. I thought maybe the man inside had a heart." Her gaze met his, steady and hard. "If I was wrong, I would have died at your step." The words struck deeper than he expected. For 3 winters, he had tried to live without being needed, without opening himself to another soul. Now, with her sitting across from him, he felt the wall he had built start to crack. He said nothing, but his jaw clenched and his hands tightened on the table. That night, when they lay again in the bed, the silence between them was heavier but not empty. Nia shifted closer without hesitation, her hand brushing lightly against his arm. Matthew stiffened at first, then let the moment pass. He could feel her heartbeat through the closeness, steady and insistent. For the first time in years, he did not lie awake haunted by the past, but listening to the breath of someone beside him. He closed his eyes with the thought that tomorrow would bring questions neither of them could avoid, about the men hunting her, about what it meant for her to stay. But for tonight, survival was enough. They were both still alive, and neither faced the storm alone. The days after the storm carried a different rhythm inside the cabin. Matthew found himself no longer moving only for himself. Every time he split wood, carried water, or checked the horses, his mind circled back to the woman who now sat by his fire. Naya had grown stronger, her skin regaining warmth, her voice less hoarse, her eyes more alert. She moved around the cabin with quiet purpose, helping where she could, mending seams, sweeping the floor with a bundled branch, portioning food carefully, as though she understood how thin the supplies would run if they weren't cautious. Matthew noticed she ate less than she needed, leaving more in the pot for him, though he said nothing about it. What he couldn't ignore was the weight of her presence. For 3 winters, his cabin had been silent. Now it breathed with 2 sets of footsteps, 2 bodies sharing the bed, 2 sets of eyes meeting in the glow of the fire. He told himself it was temporary, that once the snow eased and the trail opened again, she would move on. But when he caught her gaze lingering on the walls, on the way the light fell across the warped wood, he began to wonder if she thought of staying longer than either of them admitted. The quiet between them started to shift. Where before it had been heavy with caution, now it carried something else, something almost steadying. When she brushed past him near the stove, when her hand brushed his as she reached for a cup, when her hair fell loose as she leaned over the fire, each moment caught him off guard, reminding him how long it had been since another human touch had crossed his days. He tried not to look at the curve of her chest under the wool shirt he had given her, but his eyes betrayed him at times. Shame mixed with the pull of being alive again, and he fought to keep control. One evening, as the fire burned low and the storm had been quiet for 2 days, Matthew spoke the question that had been building since she first told him of the men hunting here. "They'll keep looking. How close do you think they are?" Naya's eyes flicked toward the door, then back to him. "Not far. They had horses. They don't give up easy." She tightened the blanket around her shoulders. "If they find me here, they'll try to take me. You too if you stand in their way." Matthew felt the old reflex rise, leave, close the door, cut ties before trouble could cross the threshold. But he had already chosen once, and the thought of sending her out into the cold now left his chest hollow. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Then we'll be ready." She studied him carefully, as if measuring whether she could trust those words. "Why, you don't know me. You owe me nothing." Matthew's jaw worked. "I owed my wife and son, and I couldn't keep them." The words came hard, heavier than he expected. "I'm not turning another soul out to die, not while I'm still standing." Silence stretched, but this time it wasn't distant. Naya lowered her eyes, her shoulders softening. She reached across the table and set her hand over his for just a moment. The touch was brief, but it carried weight. He didn't pull away. The next morning, Matthew went to check the horses and saw tracks leading along the tree line. A single horse at least, maybe 2. Not close to the cabin, but too close for comfort. He returned inside, jaw tight, and Naya read the answer in his face before he spoke. "They found the valley," he said. Her hand clenched the cup she was holding. "Then it's only time." Matthew nodded, his mind already shifting. He checked the rifle, laid out the few cartridges he had left. He hadn't fired in months, maybe a year, but the motions came back with a cold familiarity. Naya watched him, saying nothing, but he could see her breath shorten, her body tightening with the knowledge that the men she had fled were drawing near. That night, the unease settled between them. When they lay down, Matthew expected her to hold herself apart, but instead she moved closer than before, her body pressed against his side, her head resting on his chest. His arms stiffened, then lowered around her slowly, as if his body chose before his mind allowed it. He felt her heart steady against him, and in the quiet, he realized how far she had already woven herself into the life he had tried to keep empty. The cabin was no longer just his, and he knew that soon others would come to test what it meant to let her in. But as her breath steadied against him, Matthew made a decision without speaking it aloud. Whatever came down that trail, he would not hand her over. The morning broke sharp and cold, the kind of cold that froze breath before it left the mouth. Matthew opened the cabin door just far enough to look outside, scanning the tree line and the drifts that reached halfway up the corral posts. The tracks he had seen the day before had half filled with snow, but they were still there, signs of horses and not his. He stood there longer than usual, eyes narrowed, rifle in hand, though he didn't raise it. Every instinct told him the hunters Naya spoke of were close. When he shut the door again, Nia was standing by the stove, her blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, her dark eyes fixed on him. She had been watching his face, waiting for an answer he hadn't spoken yet. "They're close," he said flatly. She lowered her gaze, her lips tightening. "They won't stop," she said. "They think I belong to them." The words hit heavier than he expected. Matthew sat at the table, resting the rifle against the chair. He had spent 3 winters telling himself he would never again carry the weight of another life. But here she was, standing in his cabin, eyes still defiant, even while fear lived just beneath them. He remembered how she had looked at him the night she arrived, commanding him not to leave her outside, and he realized she had not begged once since she came. She had simply refused to break. That stirred something in him, respect mixed with something he couldn't name. He spoke after a long silence. If they come here, this place won't be easy for them. I know the ground. I've held men off before. Naya studied him. Why risk it? You don't know me. You don't even know what I've done. Matthew's jaw tightened. He looked her straight in the eye. I don't need to know. You came to my door. That makes it my fight now. For the first time since he'd met her, her shoulders softened just slightly. She looked away, almost as if she couldn't bear to hold his gaze under the weight of those words. Then she busied herself with the pot on the stove, ladling food, though neither of them was truly hungry. The day passed heavy. Matthew worked outside, clearing snow from the roof, keeping the horses fed, his eyes constantly sweeping the ridgelines. Naya followed him out once, wrapped in the shirt and blanket, and stood quietly at the edge of the corral. She seemed to be memorizing the lay of the land, the routes men might take if they came. When Matthew caught her staring too long toward the woods, he walked over. You've seen them track before, he said. She nodded. They're not many, but they know how to follow. They don't fear storms, not when they smell strength ahead. She paused, her hands clutching the blanket tighter. They'll try to wait until night. Matthew filed the words away. She knew these men better than he did. Her warning made his chest tighten with the realization that she was not just a burden dropped on his doorstep. She was a partner in her own survival. He respected that more than anything. When night came, the two of them shared the bed as before. The fire burned low, shadows stretching across the walls. Naya shifted closer, her head finding the space against his shoulder. Her hand brushed lightly over his chest, resting there for longer than before. Matthew's body tensed, then eased. He hadn't felt a woman's touch in years, and it rattled him more than the threat outside. He turned his head slightly and caught her eyes in the dim glow. She didn't speak, but her closeness spoke enough. She trusted him with her body, with her safety, and in that moment, with her fear. Sleep came late. Sometime past midnight, the horses snorted from the lean-to. Matthew's eyes shot open, every muscle on edge. He slipped from the bed carefully, pulling on his coat, his rifle already in his grip. Naya rose too, silent, her face tense. They both knew what the sound meant. He opened the door just enough to step outside. The cold cut straight through him, but he ignored it, his eyes sweeping the tree line. Movement flickered at the edge of the ridge, shadows against snow, 3 men on horseback, keeping their distance, watching. One lifted an arm as if pointing toward the cabin. Matthew's gut tightened. He stepped back inside and shut the door. They found us, he said, his voice flat but edged with steel. Naya's breath hitched, but she straightened, no panic in her eyes. They'll come at dawn, she whispered. Matthew nodded. He sat at the table, rifle laid across his lap, and looked at her. For years he had lived with no one, speaking to no one, caring for nothing but the routine that kept him standing. Now he understood with stark clarity he wasn't alone anymore. And that meant the fight coming was not just survival. It was about keeping her safe. As the fire burned low, they waited side by side for the light that would bring danger to their door. Dawn came slow and gray, the kind of light that seeped through snow clouds without warmth. The cabin walls creaked against the cold, and every sound outside felt sharper, more dangerous. Matthew Cole had not slept at all. He sat in the chair nearest the door, rifle laid across his lap, eyes fixed on the shutter that rattled every so often in the wind. His body felt coiled tight, though outwardly he stayed still. 3 men out there, maybe more, and they were waiting for the right time. Naya had not slept either. She sat close to the stove, blanket draped around her shoulders, her dark eyes steady on him. She did not ask what he planned. She simply waited. Her silence told him something he hadn't yet admitted to himself. She trusted him, even though she barely knew his name. That fact carried more weight than he wanted to feel. The questions that had lingered in the minds of anyone listening to their story, the questions Matthew himself had tried not to face, pressed against the morning now. Who were these men really? What did they want with her besides trade? And why had she been alone when she came to his door? As if sensing his unspoken thoughts, Naya spoke, her voice low but clear. They took others from my people, she said. Women, children, anyone they could sell. Some they gave to towns for work. Others, she stopped, her jaw tightening. I ran before they could take me, too. They think I'm still theirs. Matthew clenched his jaw, eyes narrowing. He had known men like that, traders who treated human lives like coin. He had seen their work before in border towns, and it had always stirred something in him he couldn't put into words. Anger mixed with shame that such men walked free. Now that anger was sharp and immediate, they were coming to his door, and they wanted her. By mid-morning, the sound of horses came faint through the wind. Matthew stood slowly, peering through a crack in the shutter. 3 riders dismounted at the edge of the clearing. They moved slowly, deliberately, scanning the cabin and the corral. They carried rifles and pistols, their faces half covered by scarves against the cold. One pointed toward the smoke rising from the chimney. They knew someone was inside. Matthew stepped back from the window, his mind working fast. He had the cabin walls for cover, 1 rifle and a revolver with a handful of cartridges. He had fought worse odds before, but never with someone else's life tied to his own. He turned to Naya. They'll try to draw me out, he said. If I go down, you run out the back and take the ridge. Don't look back. She stood abruptly, her blanket falling to the floor. No, I won't leave. Matthew met her gaze. You don't understand what they'll do if they catch you. Her voice hardened. I do understand. That's why I won't run. If they take you, they take me anyway. I stay. For a moment, Matthew felt the same frustration that had weighed on him since she appeared at his door. She was stubborn, unyielding. But then something shifted in him. He realized she wasn't being reckless. She had survived this long because she refused to break. That strength was what had carried her to his cabin alive, and now it steadied him. He gave a short nod. And stay low, don't stand near the windows. The first voice came from outside, rough and commanding. Man inside, send the girl out and we'll leave you by Matthew felt his grip tighten on the rifle. He gave no answer. He moved to the window, raised the barrel through the crack, and fired a warning shot. The bullet struck the snow near the rider's boots, throwing powder into the air. The men shouted, scattering toward cover. Their answer came quick. Gunfire slamming into the cabin walls, splinters flying from the doorframe. Naya ducked near the stove, hands over her head, but her eyes stayed open, watching him. Matthew kept low, moving from one shutter to the next, firing steady, measured shots. He wasn't aiming to kill at first, only to keep them back, to remind them the cabin was not an easy prize. But as the minutes dragged and their fire grew heavier, he knew the fight would not end without blood. One of the men tried to make a run for the stable. Matthew saw him break cover and fired. The man fell hard into the snow, his rifle tumbling from his grip. The other 2 shouted, their voices angry, carrying through the wind. More shots slammed into the cabin. One shattering a lantern on the shelf, spraying oil across the floor. Naya leapt forward, smothering the spill with a blanket before it could ignite. Matthew's eyes flicked toward her, a sharp breath of relief catching in his chest. She was not a burden. She was fighting in her own way, keeping them alive. The shooting slowed after a while. The men outside called out again. You can't hold us off forever, Cowboy. Give her up and we'll let you live. Matthew's voice came out steady, low, carrying the weight of all the winters he had endured alone. She's not yours. You want her, you'll have to die for it. Silence followed, then the crunch of boots on snow. They were circling, trying to find a blind spot. Matthew reloaded quickly, his hands moving with practiced ease. He slid the revolver across the table to Nia. She stared at it, then picked it up, her hand steady. I can shoot, she said firmly. He studied her for a moment, then gave a short nod. Then watch the back. Don't waste a round unless you have to. The next assault came harder. One man rushed the cabin, firing as he came. Matthew dropped to one knee, sighted through the shutter, and pulled the trigger. The man went down, snow exploding around him. Another charge from the opposite side, but before Matthew could turn, a single shot cracked from behind him. Naya stood at the rear shutter, revolver in hand, her eyes blazing. The man outside stumbled back, clutching his arm, and retreated into the trees, breathless. Matthew turned toward her. For a long moment, they just stared at one another. The quiet cowboy who had sworn to keep his heart closed, and the woman who had walked into his life on the edge of death. She had stood her ground, not as a helpless fugitive, but as someone willing to fight beside him. Outside, the last man shouted something guttural, then mounted his horse and fled. The clearing fell silent, except for the heavy beat of Matthew's heart and the hiss of wind through the eaves. He lowered his rifle slowly, shoulders sagging under the weight of what had just passed. Inside the cabin, smoke hung low from the shattered lantern. Naya set the revolver down, her chest rising fast with each breath. Matthew crossed to her, his hands rough and cold, and touched her arm gently. She looked up at him, eyes still sharp but softer now, filled with something new. Something neither of them had allowed themselves in too long. "You stayed," he said quietly. Her voice was steady, almost defiant. "I told you I would." For the first time in 3 winters, Matthew felt the wall around him crack wide. They were both still alive, not because he had saved her, but because they had stood together. As the fire was rebuilt and the cabin settled back into silence, Matthew knew one thing with certainty: the men would not stop. But he also knew he would never again face the cold alone. The clearing outside of the cabin was quiet again, but it was not the quiet of peace. The bodies in the snow, the trails of blood leading back into the trees, and the broken lantern glass across the floor, all told a story that could not be undone. Matthew Cole moved through it with the steady movements of a man who had seen violence before, but inside his chest a storm churned. He had sworn to leave that life behind, to keep his world narrowed down to chores and silence. Yet the gun in his hands reminded him of the past he had tried to bury. He stepped outside into the brutal cold. The first man he had shot lay sprawled near the corral, snow already dusting over his still form. Another crawled weakly near the tree line, leaving a dark trail behind him. The third had fled, but Matthew knew it wouldn't be the end. Men like that didn't forgive losses. They gathered others and came back. His pale eyes swept the ridges before returning to the cabin. Inside, Naya was crouched by the fire, feeding it new wood, her face half lit by the glow. She had the revolver beside her still, though it now lay quiet on the floor. Her hands moved steadily, but her breathing was quick, as if her body had not yet convinced itself the danger was over. When Matthew entered, she looked up, her eyes meeting his. There was no fear in them now, only a sharp steadiness that startled him. "They'll come again," she said simply. Matthew set his rifle against the wall, pulling off his gloves. "Yes," he replied. He moved to the table, sat down, and rubbed his hands across his face. He hadn't spoken much since the shooting, but he knew she deserved more than silence. "You held your ground," he said after a pause. "You didn't have to." Naya's eyes hardened. "If I run every time, I'm nothing but prey. I won't be prey." The words struck something in him. He remembered his wife's fever, his boy's small hand going limp, and the helplessness that had followed. He had hated himself for being unable to change it, but watching Naya fire that revolver, watching her stand her ground, had stirred something different. He didn't see helplessness in her. He saw fight, and it made him want to fight too. The cabin bore scars of the fight. A bullet lodged in the frame of the window, another in the table leg, oil stains darkening the floor where the lantern had broken. Matthew began repairs the next morning, patching wood with what little he had. Naya worked beside him, gathering snow to melt for water, scrubbing the floor and laying blankets over the drafts. They moved without many words, but there was a rhythm in it, 2 people adjusting to survival as a pair instead of alone. Questions hung unspoken in the air, and Matthew knew any listener would wonder them too. Where had Naya come from before the traders? Did she have kin still alive? And why had she chosen his cabin when she could have passed it by? That night, after they had eaten what little stew was left and the fire burned low, Matthew asked the question straight. "Was there no one left with you? No family?" Naya's hand stilled on the bowl. She looked into the flames before answering. "My father was killed when soldiers came. My mother taken by sickness. I had one brother. They traded him south 2 winters ago." Her voice did not break, but her eyes dimmed. "I am the last." Matthew felt the words land heavy. He knew loss, but hers was different. Her people scattered, her family stripped from her, her future narrowed down to survival in the hands of men who hunted her. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling beams, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest. He had told himself there was nothing left worth protecting in his life. But now here was a woman who carried more loss than even he had known, sitting in his cabin, refusing to bend. He reached across the table, his hand rough and scarred, and laid it over hers. She tensed at first, then let it stay. For a long moment they sat like that, neither speaking, the fire casting shadows around them. When her eyes finally lifted to meet his, there was something in them he hadn't seen before. Not defiance, not fear, but a quiet need for closeness. That night when they lay down, Naya shifted closer again, but this time her hand did not stop at his arm. She pressed her palm to his chest, her eyes on his face, waiting. Matthew's breath slowed, his heart pounding beneath her touch. He had sworn never to open himself again, but her presence broke through the walls he had built. He leaned down, hesitated only a moment, then pressed his lips gently against hers. The kiss was not wild or desperate. It was slow, careful, restrained, as though both feared it might shatter what had grown between them. But it carried weight. Years of silence in him, years of survival in her, meeting in a moment that spoke louder than words. When it broke, she rested her forehead against his, her breath warm against his cheek. "You didn't turn me out," she whispered. Matthew's voice was low, almost raw. "And I won't." They lay in silence after that, but it was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two people who had chosen, at least for now, to stay. The next day, Matthew made his choice clear in action. He dug a trench near the corral, set boards against the windows, and stocked wood by the door. Nia helped, hauling snow, breaking branches for kindling, carrying water. She no longer acted like a guest in his home. She acted like she belonged there. By nightfall, the cabin felt changed. The scars of the fight were still there, but so was a new strength. Matthew sat by the fire, watching Nia sew the sleeve of his coat where a bullet had torn it. Her fingers moved carefully, her hair falling across her cheek, the firelight warming her skin. For the first time in years, he felt something he had thought gone for good: hope. But as he watched her, he also knew the danger was not finished. The men would not forgive their dead so easily. They would return, and when they did, the fight would be harder. Still, when Nia looked up and met his eyes, he felt certain of one thing: they would face it together. The cabin no longer felt like the place Matthew Cole had kept for himself all those silent years. Where once the space carried only the sound of his boots on the floorboards and the creak of old wood in the wind, now it breathed with two lives, hers and his. Every corner seemed to carry her presence. The wool shirt folded neatly after she wore it, the needle and thread always near her hand, the blanket she spread across the floor when she worked by the fire. For years, Matthew had let the days pass without care for such details, but now he noticed them, and he noticed her. Still, danger hung heavy. He knew the fight was not finished. 3 men had come, 2 had fallen, and 1 had escaped. A survivor meant word would spread. More would follow, drawn by anger, greed, or promise of trade. It was not a question of if they would come. The thought sharpened his every action. He repaired the cabin walls, checked the rifle more often, and began carrying the revolver at his side again. Nia, sensing his worry, carried herself with the same quiet readiness. She did not shrink from the threat, but she did not pretend it wasn't there. That morning, Matthew found her outside, standing near the corral. The snow was hard underfoot, the air biting cold. She had wrapped herself into his coat, her dark hair falling across her shoulders. Her eyes scanned the tree line, searching, as if she could will herself to see danger before it arrived. "You watch like someone who's hunted," Matthew said quietly as he approached. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I am hunted." She paused, then added, "And so are you now, because you chose to stand with me." He looked past her across the drifts that led into the forest and said nothing. He had lived 3 winters alone, convinced he was beyond choosing. But she was right. His choice had already been made when he opened the door and let her in. Later that day, as they worked together, splitting wood, Nia finally asked the question she had held back. "Why do you live out here alone?" Matthew's hands paused on the axe. He thought of the fever that had taken his wife. of the boy he had buried under frozen ground. His throat tightened. "I had a family," he said simply. "I lost them. After that, I figured silence was all I had left." Naya studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes softer than usual. "Silence keeps you alive," she said, "but it doesn't keep you whole." The words cut deep. Matthew looked at her, wanted to argue, but he couldn't. She had lived through losses of her own, her family gone, her people scattered, and still she spoke as someone who refused to break. He saw in her the strength he had once tried to bury in himself. That night they shared the bed again, and this time the closeness between them carried no hesitation. When she leaned against him, he wrapped his arm around her fully, his hand resting against her side. She turned her face up toward his, and he kissed her again. Deeper this time, the weight of it pulling years of silence from him. For a long moment they stayed like that, breathing each other in, the firelight flickering across their faces. When they parted, Naya pressed her forehead against his chest, her words quiet but steady. "You didn't turn me out. That makes you mine now, whether you want it or not." Matthew let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though rough and low. "Then I'm yours." But peace was short. Near dawn, the horses spooked again, their whinnies sharp and frightened. Matthew rose fast, pulling on his boots, reaching for his rifle. He stepped outside, Naya close behind him, and his eyes caught the shapes on the ridge. Not 3 men this time, 6, maybe 7, mounted and carrying rifles, their silhouettes dark against the snow. They had come back stronger. They brought more. Nia whispered, her hand tightening on his arm. Matthew's jaw clenched. He knew the cabin would not hold against so many if they pressed hard. They would need more than walls and bullets. They would need resolve. He turned to her. "If it comes to it, we fight together. No running, no surrender." Naya's eyes blazed. "I already told you. I stay." The riders did not charge immediately. They lingered on the ridge, watching, waiting. Matthew knew the pattern, testing fear, trying to break nerves before striking. He led Naya back inside, bolting the door. He checked his rifle, laid out cartridges, and handed her the revolver again. Their eyes met in the lamplight, no words needed. The hours dragged. Snow fell steadily, muffling the world outside. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind felt like the moment before attack. Nia sat across from him at the table, revolver resting near her hand, her gaze unblinking. He realized then that anyone listening to their story would wonder, was she afraid? Did she regret choosing his cabin that night? But he saw no regret in her. If anything, there was a kind of fierce calm, as though she had decided long before this moment that she would rather fight than be taken again. By nightfall, the men on the ridge had moved closer. Matthew glimpsed them through the shutter cracks, shadows weaving between trees, preparing. He knew dawn would bring another assault, harder than before. He turned from the window and met Naya's eyes. "They'll come tomorrow," he said. Her reply was simple. "Then tomorrow we kill them." The fire burned low, the storm quiet outside, and for the first time in years, Matthew felt something more than fear before a fight. He felt the steady strength of standing with someone who had chosen him just as much as he had chosen her. Whatever came with the dawn, they would face it together. The gray light of dawn returned, heavy with snow clouds, but this morning was not like the others. Matthew Cole stood at the window crack, his rifle steady in his hands, watching the shapes move along the tree line. 6 men at least, rifles slung across their shoulders, their horses stamping against the cold. They had not come to threaten. They had come to finish. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low but steady. Naya sat on the floor beside the stove, revolver resting in her lap. Her dark hair fell loose over the wool shirt he had given her, and her eyes were hard and alert. She didn't look frightened. She looked ready. And in that moment, Matthew realized something he had not dared admit aloud. She had walked to his door that first night not only to survive, but to choose. She had chosen to live, and she had chosen him to stand with. "They'll hit hard this time," Matthew said quietly. Naya's gaze lifted, steady and sharp. "Then we hit harder." For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the pop of the fire. Anyone listening to their story would wonder the same questions that now pressed at Matthew. Was he willing to risk his life, his cabin, his future for this woman he had known only days? The answer settled in his chest, as firm as the rifle in his hands. Yes, because in the days since she'd arrived, the silence of his life had been broken, and he would not go back. The first shots came sudden, slamming into the cabin wall, sending splinters across the floor. Matthew dropped to a knee, firing back through the shutter. One rider spun from his horse, falling into the snow. The others shouted, their voices sharp in the cold air. Naya crawled to the back shutter, raising the revolver. Her hands were steady. When a shadow appeared between the trees, she fired. The man cursed loudly, stumbling back, his rifle dropping to the ground. Gunfire cracked across the clearing. Wood splintered, and smoke filled the cabin. Matthew kept moving from one window to the next, firing measured shots, never wasting a cartridge. He could hear the men outside cursing, shouting orders, trying to circle the cabin. He felt the familiar pull of battle, the thud of his heart, the sting of gunpowder in the air. The way time slowed down to nothing but sound and aim. But this time it was different. He wasn't fighting for himself, he was fighting for her. The men pressed harder, two of them making a run for the corral. Matthew swung the shutter open and fired twice. One went down hard, the other fled back toward the trees. But more shots came in return, one smashing through the window frame, so close Matthew felt it would scrape his cheek. He ducked, reloading fast, his hands moving with muscle memory burned from old years. Beside him, Naya rose from the floor, her eyes blazing. She moved to the table, snatching up the spare cartridges he had left there. She handed them to him without flinching, her voice sharp. Don't stop. They'll break if you keep pressing. Her certainty struck him. She wasn't begging him to end it. She wasn't hiding. She was standing with him, as if she had always been meant to. He loaded, raised the rifle, and fired again. Another man dropped. The shouting outside turned to hesitation. The men had expected an easy prize, but now three of their own lay dead in the snow, another wounded. They fired one last ragged volley into the cabin. Then Matthew heard the sound of retreat, boots thudding through drifts, saddles creaking as they mounted up. In moments, the clearing grew quiet but for the groan of the wind. Matthew held his aim through the crack until the last rider vanished into the trees. Then slowly he lowered the rifle. His chest heaved, his arms ached, but his eyes stayed sharp, waiting. When no sound came but the hiss of wind, he turned back inside. Naya still held the revolver, but her shoulders eased. Her dark eyes met his, and for the first time since the fight began, she let out a long, unsteady breath. Matthew crossed to her, setting his rifle aside. Without words, he placed his hand over hers, lowering the revolver gently to the table. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. The quiet cowboy who had shut the world out, and the woman who had knocked on his door with nothing but defiance and desperation. It's over, Matthew said, his voice low but certain. They'll not come again? She asked, though her tone was less doubt and more hope. They lost too many. Men like that don't waste themselves on a fight they can't win. He paused, his jaw tightening. And even if they try, they'll find us waiting. The words seemed to settle something in her. She stepped closer, her hand brushing against his chest, her body trembling now that the danger had passed. He let out a breath, lowering his forehead to hers, their closeness filling the cabin more than the fire ever could. She whispered, her voice barely above the crackle of the flames. Then I stay, if you'll have me. Matthew's throat tightened. For 3 winters, he had lived with nothing but silence and grief. Now, with her standing before him, the choice was simple. Stay, he said firmly. This is your home now, same as mine. Her eyes softened, and then her lips found his. The kiss carried no hesitation this time, only the weight of survival, of choice, of 2 broken lives deciding to bind together. His arms wrapped around her, holding her as though to promise she would never face the cold alone again. Days later, the snow still deep outside. The cabin bore scars of the battle, bullet holes patched with rough wood, broken shutters nailed back into place. But inside, it was different. The stove burned hotter, the meals were shared, the silence no longer empty but full of unspoken understanding. Matthew rose each day not for himself alone, but for her. Naya, once a hunted woman with no one left, now moved with a steadiness that came from knowing she belonged somewhere. Anyone who passed the clearing months later would see only smoke from the chimney, a man tending horses, and a woman gathering water from melted snow. But inside, the truth was simple. They had chosen to stay, and in staying, they had found what both thought lost forever. Not just survival, family. The story ended not with a question, but with certainty. Matthew, Cole, and Nia would face every winter together, and neither would ever be alone again. The story of Matthew, Cole, and Nia in the snowbound Wyoming winter of 1881 offers a deeply moving lesson about the transformative power of opening one's heart to another, even amidst grief and fear. Matthew, a man hollowed by the loss of his wife and son, could have shut his door to Nia, preserving the solitude he'd clung to for years. Instead, he let her in, choosing compassion over isolation. And together they faced not just a brutal storm, but the violent men hunting her. Nia's fierce refusal to be prey, her choice to stand and fight beside Matthew, teaches us that resilience is not just surviving, but claiming one's right to belong. Their bond, forged in shared danger and quiet moments of trust, shows that love and family can emerge from the ashes of loss when two souls dare to choose each other. This tale stirs the soul, reminding us that even in our darkest winters, a single act of courage, opening a door, standing together, can rebuild what we thought was gone forever. It challenges us to look at the strangers in our lives and ask, could they be the ones to break our silence? Please share your thoughts in the comments. What does this story awaken in you? Have you ever found strength in an unexpected connection? Like, subscribe, and hit the bell to join our community for more stories that touch the heart and inspire us to embrace life's risks for the sake of love. Your support keeps these powerful narratives alive.